Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in today. I'm David Robinson, the senior minister here at CCC, and I grew up in East Tennessee, the city of Bristol, Tennessee, specifically, not too far from the Bristol Motor Speedway. My father still lives there. He's 84 years old. He retired about 4 or 5 years ago after serving as a minister for 60 years, 53 of which he served as the senior minister of the same church in Bristol. 53 years he was the senior minister of a church that's located less than a mile down from the Bristol Motor Speedway. Many of you have met my father. He's preached here at CCC on several occasions before retiring. Some of you know him. I wish all of you could meet and could know him. He's a guy who went about living his life and went about ministering and leading his church with a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and joy. You don't endure that long unless you have a healthy dose of joy in what you're doing. It was almost like joy was fuel for his ministry. You know, I was in the BWI airport on one occasion. I was going to a conference in Orlando, and there was a group of people there who were going to the same conference, and they were from Louisville, Kentucky. Their connecting flight took them from Louisville to Baltimore and then on to Orlando. So we were getting ready to board the same flight to go to the same city, to go to the same conference. And they were from Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky, a big old church. And I knew some of the folks from there, had worked with them on some church planning teams to get some new churches started. And so I was seeing some of these folks, and there was a guy there who they introduced me to who was a campus pastor for one of the campuses at Southeast Christian Church. And he was a Milligan College graduate. Now, Milligan College is a school in East Tennessee, not too far from my dad's old church. My oldest son, Daniel, he graduated there this past May. But sometimes there would be students from Milligan who would visit that church or attend that church that my dad led while they were in school. And so when they introduced me to this guy, they made the connection that I was from East Tennessee and that my dad was a longtime senior minister at that particular church in Bristol. And the guy says, wait, you mean the church in Bristol there down from the NASCAR track? I said, yeah. He said, you're David Robinson? Your dad is Bob Robinson? I said, yeah, that's him. He said, I would sometimes go to that church when I was in school at Milligan, and I loved your dad. I loved listening to him and watching him preach and lead and teach. And then I'll never forget this quote he said about my dad. He said, now there's a guy who's having a good time. And he said it encouraged him because that's what it's supposed to look like. Many of you know my father. I wish all of you could know him. He's been a joyful guy, as far as I can tell, all his life and certainly all his ministry. And I think that's the way it's supposed to be for all of us. Lewis Smedes put it like this: you were made for joy, and to miss out on joy is to miss out on the reason for your existence. C.S. Lewis put it like this: joy is the serious business of heaven. The Apostle Paul, he put it like this in the book of Philippians in the Bible. Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. See, the Bible puts this in the non-optional category. This is a command. We are commanded to be full of joy. In part, what it means to be a follower of Jesus is to be full of joy. Every once in a while, Jesus would give a kind of mission statement. He would explain why it is that he came to earth and why he taught what he taught. In the 15th chapter of the Gospel of John in the Bible, Jesus gives one of those statements. Jesus said this: I have said these things to you so that my joy, the joy that Jesus experiences, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Jesus wants his followers to have his joy. Jesus said he came and taught in part to inebriate people with joy. The problem with human beings, according to Jesus, is not that we're too happy for God and God wants us to get into being more serious. It's that we're not yet happy enough by far and God wants us to get into joy. And so Jesus says, I have come as the great joy bringer. I've come so that you may be filled with my kind of joy. I experienced the fullness of joy, Jesus says, and I want you to experience the fullness of my joy because joy lives in the heart of God. There was a great author by the name of G.K. Chesterton, and he put it like this, trying to communicate something about our joyful God. This is what he wrote. A child kicks his legs rhythmically through excess, not the absence of life, because children have abounding vitality because they are in spirit fierce and free. Therefore, they want things repeated and are still excited. They always say, do it again. And the grown-up person does it again until they're nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, do it again to the sun, and every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never got tired of making them. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture he paints here that year after year after year, millennia after millennia after millennia, God making daisy after daisy. I mean, think about it. They're not good for anything. Daisies. I mean, you can hold a daisy up under somebody's chin to see if they like butter, but it's not really scientific, I don't think. But 500 trillion daisies. And the angels ask God, hey, God, what are you going to do today? And God gets that look in his eye and he says, I think I'm going to make me some more daisies. And he says, do it again. Now, why does he do this? Well, Chesterton says, because God has an infinite capacity for joy. Because with God, every day, every moment is worth living in the now. It may be, Chesterton concludes, that God has the eternal appetite of infancy. For we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. That's so good. We have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. To help us get a sense of the joyfulness of God, I want to do a little exercise in contrast. I mean, imagine for just a moment how the opening sentences of the Bible, what the first paragraphs of Genesis might look like if God were not a supremely joyful God. I mean, what would the Bible look like in its very beginning if God approached his life, his work, the same way that we tend to approach ours? Well, here's a shot at what the Bible might look like in the opening chapters of the book of Genesis if God were not a joyful God. In the beginning, it was 9 o'clock, so God had to go to work. He filled out a requisition to separate the light from darkness. He considered making stars to beautify the night, but thought it sounded like too much work. And besides, thought God, it's not my job. So he decided to knock off early and just call it a day. He looked at what he had done, and God said, it'll have to do. On the second day, God separated the waters from the dry land, and he made all the dry land flat and plain and functional so that, behold, the whole earth looked like Indiana. He thought about making mountains and valleys and glaciers and jungles and forests and waterfalls, but he decided it wouldn't be worth the effort. And God looked at what he'd done that day, and God said, it'll have to do. And God made a pigeon to fly in the air, and a carp to swim in the waters, and a cat to creep upon the dry ground. And God thought about making millions of other species of all sizes and all shapes and all colors, but he couldn't drum up any enthusiasm for any other animals. And in fact, he wasn't too crazy about the cat. So God looked at all his hands had done, and he said, it'll have to do. And at the end of the week, God was seriously burned out. So he breathed a big sigh of relief and said, thank me, it's Friday. Now, the good news is Genesis doesn't sound like that. The opening chapter of the book of Genesis throbs with this refrain that God spoke, and it was so, and God saw that it was good. Over and over each day, God speaks, and it's so, and God sees that it's good. God takes great joy in the work of his hand. The first day was a joy-filled day, and he delighted in it. The next day, God said to the light, do it again. And he says it to the light every day after day, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Do it again. He says it to this very day and this very morning. He never gets tired of it, never loses the joy of it. For we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. We will not understand God until we understand this about him. God is the happiest being in all the universe. It's not Kelly Ripa. It's not Jimmy Fallon. It's God. Of course, God also knows sorrow, and Jesus was called a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. But the sorrow of God and the anger of God, they are his temporary response to a fallen world. And they will be banished forever on that great day when the world is finally set right once and for all. But joy is God's basic character. Joy is God's eternal destiny. God is the happiest being in all this universe, and joy is God's desire for the human race. Joy is God's desire for you. And for many of us, joy is a missing ingredient in our life. But it's God's intent that his creation, that you and me, would mirror his joy. You know, many of these things we're talking about in this series are reflections of the character of God. That's where it comes from, which is why it makes such sense for us to reflect upon it. Now, there's a problem in talking about all this. The problem, of course, is some of you lack joy because you feel guilty a lot. And now you're going to start feeling guilty over not feeling joyful, and it's going to make you feel even less joyful. And what I'm trying to establish today is just that it's okay to be joyful. I mean, we'll certainly go beyond that. But to begin with, if we could just understand it's okay to pursue joy. And it's more than okay, it's commanded. I mean, the biblical writers wouldn't have commanded it if we're not within our reach. But joyfulness, it's a learned skill. It's the result of practices and patterns in our life. It's possible to learn to be joyful, and that's a place to start. I mean, sociological research bears this out. According to the social sciences, genetics account for about 50% of our baseline for happiness and joy. In other words, some people are more sort of naturally like Eeyore, while others kind of lean more toward Tigger, 50%, that's sort of the baseline. Only 10% of our happiness and joy is accounted for by circumstances like, job, status, relationships, health, that kind of thing. And what that means is that 40% of our happiness depends on the choices we make and the habits we develop, which is huge. And it's really the place to start. We've got to determine that we will relentlessly pursue joy, and joy will be a goal, and that I can get there. Now, one caveat here, the joy that the Bible commands, it's in the framework of a Christ-honoring life. I mean, you understand this is not saying do anything you want that'll kind of make you happy. What the Bible commands is the joy of the Lord. That is joy that's experienced in a life where Jesus Christ is the Lord of it. I mean, Jesus told his followers there again in John 15, I want to give you my joy. So a place to start with all this is to understand that you and I, we can become joyful people. With God's help, it really is possible. So we got to take responsibility for it. We got to take responsibility for our joy. It's not up to our friends, not up to our boss, not up to our teachers, not up to our parents, not up to our kids, not up to our loved ones. Your joy is your responsibility. Now, question, when are we going to pursue and practice joy? When are we going to go after it? When are we going to practice it? I mean, if it's such a wonderful thing and if it's commanded to us, when will we pursue it? Well, Psalm 118 in the Bible puts it like this. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. When are we going to practice joy? In this day, today. We have to begin now, right now, today. The psalmist doesn't say, tomorrow is God's day. I'll endure until I get there and then I'll rejoice then. And he doesn't say yesterday was God's day. How happy I was then. He says it's today. And he says that, I think, partly because we live in a world with this illusion that says, hey, I'll be happy someday when the conditions in my life change and become easier and become better and become more how I want them to be. Now, the psalmist says, this is God's day. This is the day that God made. This is the day God has redeemed through Jesus. This is the day. If we're going to be joyful, we must be joyful today. Now, I understand some are in a place where you need to grieve. You've experienced trauma or loss in your life. And so I'll just say to understand this call to joy is not a call to be an artificial person or put on some sort of plastic smile. We are certainly to experience the full range of emotions in life. But on the whole, for the most of us, the call to joy is a call to rejoice in this day. And some have probably considered another problem too. I mean, Dave, how can I embrace joy with all the pain and suffering in the world? Is it even right to be joyful in a world that has such suffering and violence and injustice? That's a good question because any deeply thoughtful person has got to face that question. We're not trying to be glib and superficial here. But when you study joy, you kind of come to this surprising discovery that generally it's the people who are closest to suffering, who have voluntarily, out of love, taken on the suffering of others around them, who end up having the most authentic, indestructible, powerful joy. People who were close to Mother Teresa said that instead of being defeated by the suffering around her, she kind of glowed with joy, just kind of radiated out of her. It was more than anything, kind of attracted people to want to come and work with her. This authentic kind of joy, rejoicing in the Lord, is the very opposite of selfish, kind of self-centered pleasure pursuits. In fact, the test of authentic joy is that it's always compatible with pain because joy in this world will always be joy in spite of something. The truth is, if we don't rejoice today, we won't rejoice at all. If we wait until conditions are perfect, we're going to wait until we die. If we're going to rejoice, it's got to be this day, for this is the day that the Lord has made. So you may be saying, okay, Dave, how do I pursue it? Well, if we're serious about going after it, here's how we got to go for it. First off, I would say it's very simple. It's almost embarrassing how simple this is. But if you want to pursue joy, if you want to become a joyful person, you need to hang around joyful people. Proverbs 15:30 in the Bible says, a cheerful look brings joy to the heart, and good news brings health to the bones. Here's the truth about human beings. There are people in your world who have rejected joy, who have decided almost to become victims. They don't want joy, and they don't want you to be joyful either. They're sort of black holes of joy. And if you give them the power, they will suck the joy and life and vitality right out of you. Little Halloween joke for you on this Halloween weekend. Why is Dracula not invited to any parties? Because he sucks the life out of everyone. All right, cut me some slack. We all know people like this. I'm sure you have some of these joy-destroying people in your life. And it's important to love them as best as you can. Be as understanding and patient and tolerant and kind to them as you're able to be. But be very careful not to allow them to shape or mold or kind of run your life. And you may even need to limit your exposure to them in an attempt to refrain their ability to sway your heart until your ability to live in joy is a little bit stronger. If we're serious about pursuing joy, we got to spend regular, I would even say large amounts of time around life-enhancing, joy-producing people. And let me just say it's okay to do that. Be intentional about being around people who will give and teach you joy. All right, another thing. The first is hang out around joyful people. And the second is practice the discipline of gratitude and thanksgiving. Discipline yourself to practice it. And I use this word discipline very deliberately because gratitude can be as much a spiritual discipline as to read the Bible or to pray or to confess or to fast. For some, there will not be a more helpful discipline in your spiritual growth, in your spiritual formation, than to engage in the practice of gratitude. We are invited to rejoice in every moment of life because every moment of life is grace. It really is. Every moment of life. We don't earn it. We don't control it. We can't take a moment of it for granted. Every tick of the clock is a gift of grace from God. Every moment we are to rejoice and thank God for it. This is somewhat the theology of joy. The very language used to describe joy, the word charin, it's used about 116 times in the New Testament. It's related to the word charis, which is the word for grace. And it's also connected to the word for gratitude. And so catch this, the root word, chara, is in each of these related words. Grace and joy and thanks. They're intertwined. Every moment of this day is grace from God. So rejoice and thank God for it. And every once in a while, the veil is kind of lifted in this life, and we really see this a bit more clearly. I have 3 kids, and my youngest is my daughter, Elise, who's a junior in high school now. And Elise, since she was a little girl, has always loved to play soccer. And she's excelled at it. And she loves it. Loves it. Hopes to play in college after high school. Getting to play soccer is one of the great joys of her life. And it's one of the great joys of my life, too, to get to watch her play. There's a a joy. For those of you who are parents, you'll understand this, but there's a joy for parents to watch their kids do what they love to do and seem to have a knack for. And that's the case for us with Elise. She's currently wrapping up her high school season of her junior year here. Then her club team, they'll kick in. Soccer's pretty much year round. But this time last year, Elise wasn't playing soccer, not because of the pandemic, but because she was in a back brace. She had struggled for most of last year with some back pain, and it was quite mysterious. We couldn't get to the root cause of it all. She had been to a myriad of doctors. She had a bunch of different MRIs, lots of physical therapy for different diagnoses. We had chased all these different trails trying to put our finger on and alleviate the pain for her. And it wasn't just when she would play soccer. She was in pain just sitting in a chair. But the thing she loved to do more than anything, playing soccer, it was sort of a casualty of all this pain that we couldn't get to the bottom of. So they ended up about this time last year to put her in a back brace for a couple months, October and November. Eventually, she gets out of that and starts some minor physical therapy for a couple of months. In February, they wanted to try to get her back on the field to start some minor on-field activity. Eventually, she was cleared to go back at it with some restrictions, of course, through the spring, and she still ended up having some pain at times. Somewhere in the summer, though, things kind of turned, and we seemed to get a handle on it, and now she headed into the fall in her high school season. She was ready to rock and roll. And I got to tell you, my perspective, it's that now I get to watch her play. It's just all a grace note. It's all a gracious gift from God. Every game, every practice, every day out of that brace and not in pain is simply a joy-filled moment. Win or lose, rain or shine, they played this last Tuesday against, the number one team in the area in the pouring rain. And it was a tough loss at the very end of the game from a corner kick that did us in. But who cares? Rain or shine, win or lose, just being out there, able to play is a gracious act of God. So I'm grateful. This time last year, I was wondering if my daughter was going to live in pain for the rest of her life and was hoping she'd be able to sit in a chair and have relief. And now she's flying around a soccer field doing something she loves and looks like she can continue into college. Thank God. There are times when we actually experience the truth of this, not just intellectually, but really experience that life, all of life, it's just grace. So practice the discipline of gratitude. All right, final thing. Hang out with joyful people, practice the discipline of gratitude and thanksgiving. And then finally, discipline your mind to view life from a biblical perspective. Discipline your mind. That is, begin to attend to your thoughts and think about life from a biblical perspective, because to a large extent, joy flows from certain kinds of thinking. Cognitive psychologists, they remind us that always between the events that happen to us and our responses to them lie our beliefs or interpretations of those events. And this helps us understand the irrepressible theme of joy in the New Testament. The New Testament writers were engaged not so much in some form of positive thinking as in what might be called eschatological thinking. That is, they viewed all events in light of the resurrection of Jesus and the ultimate triumph of the risen Lord. Certain kinds of thinking will lead you into joy, and certain kinds of thinking will defeat your joy. And this sounds kind of formidable, but in fact, it's a wonderfully liberating thing to do, to learn to view life from a biblical perspective with a resurrected, risen Lord. Think of it like this. Robert Fulghum, he tells a story about a wedding that he officiated, and it's kind of a parable. And the central character in this parable is the MOTB. You know who the MOTB is? The mother of the bride. All right, so main characters, the mother of a bride of a wedding that's about to take place. And all the logistics from like an 18-piece brass and wind ensemble to gift registries spreading across most of the continental U.S. to bridesmaids, groomsmen, flower petal throwers, ring bearers. The mother of the bride had just planned on this on a scale usually seen only in the movies. Nobody knew it, but this mother of the bride had been waiting with a script for a production that would have been met with Steven Spielberg's approval. Just a royal, big old audacious wedding fit for a princess bride. And the plans, they were all kind of working to a T until the climactic moment of the processional, The guests, Fulcum says, had, packed in the church, and the choir loft, the orchestra was playing great music. And then the mother, she coasted down the aisle with a great deal of grandeur, similar to that of an opera diva at the premiere performance. I mean, never did the mother of a bride take her seat with more satisfaction. She had done it. She glowed and beamed and smiled and sighed. And then the music softened, and 9 decked out bridesmaids made their way down the long aisle. And then the groom with his men marched stoically into place too. And finally, the wedding march thundered from the orchestra. Here comes the bride, preceded by 4 enthusiastic mini princesses, just chucking flower petals, and 2 little ring bearers, one for each ring. And the congregation, they rose and they turned in anticipation, and there was the bride. She had been dressed for hours, if not days, and no adrenaline was left in her body. She had been left alone with her dad in the reception hall of the church while the march of her bridesmaids went on, and she walked along the tables with all these gourmet goodies, and she just kind of absent-mindedly sampled all kinds of things. First, she started in with those little pink and yellow and green mints. And she picked through the silver bowls of mixed nuts. Then she followed that with a cheese ball or 2, and then some olives, and then a handful of glazed almonds, even a little sausage with a little frilly toothpick stuck in it there, and then topped it all off with a couple of shrimps blanketed in bacon. Then she washed it all down. Her father gave her a glass of pink champagne to kind of calm her down there. And so what you noticed, Fulcum says, as the bride stood in the back in the doorway there right before she walked down the aisle, was not her dress, but her face, because her face was white, because what was coming down the aisle was a living grenade with the pin pulled out. And as she started walking down the aisle, just as she gets to her mother, the mother of the bride, she threw up. And by threw up, we're not talking like a little ladylike burp into her handkerchief. Fulcum says she puked. I mean, she hosed the front of the chancel, hitting 2 bridesmaids, the groom, a ring bearer, and Fulcum himself, the minister. Well, the mother of the groom fainted. All those little mini flower girls, they screamed. Bridesmaids were sobbing, and people with weak stomachs, they kind of headed for the exits. All the while, the orchestra kept playing. They were unaware of what was going on. Fulcum says that they kind of pulled themselves together for a much quieter, gentler ceremony in the reception hall after a little bit of time. The bride ended up being consoled a little bit. She was cleaned up. She was fitted out with a bridesmaid dress. And then Fulcum writes this: everybody cried, as people are supposed to at weddings, mostly because the groom held the bride in his arms through the whole ceremony, and no groom ever kissed the bride more tenderly than he. Isn't that a great line? And nobody who was there, he said, will ever forget it. What's interesting is that's not the end of the story. Well, the best part, he says, happened 10 years later when everybody was invited back for another party to celebrate that disaster. They actually watched the whole thing on 3 big screens because the mother of the bride, she had 3 different camera angles of that wedding from 10 years early. And the mother of the bride threw the party herself. She was laughing along with everybody else. The event that they had there, that 10-year celebration, it was hilarious, and they celebrated with great joy. Now, why could they rejoice when everything went so horribly wrong? Well, in spite of all the mess, the groom still got the bride. And after everything is said and done at a wedding, that's all that really matters. The groom got the bride, and the bride got the groom. Whatever else gets messed up, as long as the groom gets the bride, and what needs to happen, happens. How is it possible for human beings to become joy-filled people in a pain-filled world? Well, you look at the promise that comes almost at the very end of the Bible. In the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, the 19th chapter, it declares, incredibly, let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory. For the wedding of the Lamb has come and his bride has made herself ready. You see, the joy that is in store for God and his people is so great that the only picture that can do it justice is the joy between a lover and his beloved, a groom and his bride. And then we will see the wedding that the greatest weddings on this earth have only been a dim foreshadowing of. For then Jesus will be together with his followers, with you, if you're one of them, for all eternity. And the Bible says the joy will be so great then that the only picture adequate to begin to convey it is the most joyful human picture of two people so intensely in love that they couldn't stand to be apart. Joy is possible even in a desperately pain-filled world, because the end of the story is the groom gets the bride, and then God will dance with his people, and then joy will reign unblemished and uninterrupted, you see. Then the Bible says God himself will be with his people, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death and mourning and crying and pain will be no more. Then, says the Bible, in an attempt to express the inexpressible, you shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills will break forth before you into song, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. And then will dawn that great day of celebration and joy that will never, ever end. This is the day, CCC, that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it.